Thank you, Chairman. The title of this session, as you know, is The Urgent Need to Reform Our Electoral System. And I think that there are a number of questions we need to ask ourselves if we're to have any real debate about reforming the system as the organisers clearly hope. I think for a start we might ask ourselves how we wound up with the single transferable vote when 23 of the 27 member states of the European Union use some form of the list system to elect parliamentarians. Why in the name of heavens is Malta the only other country in the world to use STV? Why are we the odd man out? Then I suppose we could go on and ask ourselves what sort of a debate did we have originally about the merits of different forms of PR when we chose it, when we chose the one we have above all others? And have we subsequently really seriously analysed the effects of STV on the political system, and have we examined it for any systemic effects which have been described by the organisers as really a system which is not fit for purpose? As we meet here this week, our failure as a state has been spectacular. You could say it's been almost biblical in its proportions. The blunt truth is, as we assemble here today, is that we are a failed state which has been kept alive by the charity of friends. And I believe the root cause of the problem is the electoral system, upon which the whole of the political system is in turn based. And the electoral system has been rightly put under the spotlight here in this session under the title, as we've heard, of the urgent need to reform it. And by way of context, the brochure to the summer school makes reference to public representatives working in an unhealthy political culture, that of clientelism and of over-concentration on local issues and on individual needs at the expense of the common good. And, of course, indeed they do. Now, my belief is that if this electoral system is allowed to go unreformed, it will lead inexorably to a crisis in our political system where people will not forever consent to be governed by a state which fails in its primary duty of protecting their welfare. The social contract between the governing and the governed is based everywhere on the ability of the state to protect its citizens. Cicero, writing a long time ago, put it precisely in De Legibus, when he said that the first duty, or overriding responsibility, or supreme law, as he put it, is the welfare of the people. Salus populi suprema lex esto, sometimes written as salus populi est suprema lex. Now, when that contract is broken between the governing and the governed, then retribution is swift, as we saw in the recent general election. But were that contract to be broken again, this time by the government in power, the only other coalition of democratic forces on offer, then there is no way of knowing how the people would react. And we are faced with an existential crisis. And while there are many causes, I think it is inescapable that the low calibre of the membership of the Oireachtas, and hence of government, and the failure of the Oireachtas to function as a legislative deliberative body is at the core of the current crisis. Now, the electoral system, after all, is the root cause. It produces the parliamentarians produce the government, and that neither is up to the primary task of safeguarding the common good has been self-evident. So, how did we get ourselves into this situation? I think that's the question that the summer school organisers have asked us to address. And the answer is, in a way, that we haven't thought sufficiently deeply about why we adopted in the first place the electoral system we have and the political system as a whole, nor have we subjected either to systematic analysis in the meantime. As to how we got where it is we are, well, the answer is, as always, is history. And it goes back to Arthur Griffith. This was mentioned in passing yesterday by John Mulholland. It goes back to the foundation of the state. And what is interesting is Griffith, who was a profound political thinker, for which he is given very little regard, was a central figure here. He had been a founding member of the Electoral Reform Society here in Ireland, which agitated for the replacement of the first-past-the-post system, which was then in operation in the United Kingdom, and for its replacement by a form of PR. And in fact, he persuaded De Valera to make a political commitment to this effect when speaking as president of Sinn Féin at the Ardèche in 1919, assuring the Unionists that their interests would be protected, thereby in an independent Ireland. Indeed, on the very day that he signed the treaty in London, Griffith met representatives of the then Southern Unionists, because partition was now inevitable, and repeated that assurance, which he regarded from then on as a matter of honour. And that is why PR became enshrined in the Constitution of the Irish Free State. But of course there's a twist to the story, as always, because there was no debate as to what form of PR should be incorporated into the new Constitution, it being assumed that STV and PR were synonymous, which of course they are not. And this error has been our undoing. The reason for the error is more British than Irish, because the single transferable vote was invented in England by Thomas Hare as a means of increasing voter choice in their single-member constituencies, and it became mistakenly confused in the public mind as a result of the campaigning of John Stuart Mill with PR as a whole. Yet, when you think about it, the difference between the two systems is obvious enough. From the perspective of the elector, proportional representation is a choice between political parties, whereas the single transferable vote is a choice between candidates. That's now clear even in the United Kingdom, where the Royal Commission on Electoral Systems, worth reading, reported that STV is not a form of PR at all. It is a preferential vote, it said. This being an insight which is, unfortunately, yet to cross the Irish Sea. Hare, in fact, saw his system as a means of weakening, if not destroying, political parties. As a former General Secretary of a political party, I can testify to the fact that's exactly what he was trying to do, and it's sometimes at work. And it wasn't that people didn't know this in a way at the time, because the two authors, James Creed Meredith, who wrote a very important book in 1913 on the matter, was also a colleague of Griffith in the Electoral Reform Society, and John Commons, who had written earlier in 1907, they all pointed this out. They pointed out that STV was a particularly British form of election classically suited to their peculiar, is the word, constitutional requirements. But for Griffith, unfortunately, STV was PR, and no one of his colleagues questioned that belief. In fact, they all subscribed to it, hence it appeared in the Free State Constitution, without any real debate about its consequences. However, that Constitution, which was discussed here yesterday in some regards, did have the merit of leaving the form of PR to be used to the Oireachtas to be prescribed by legislation. When it came to the legislation, they chose STV simply without any reflection. On the other hand, Bunreacht na hÉireann is unfortunately far more prescriptive in that it refers to the election of members on the system of proportional representation by means of the single transferable vote. Of course, that means that the electoral system can only be changed by referendum, which Fianna Fáil tried to do twice unsuccessfully, first in 1957 and then in 1968. And there was no real debate on either referendum, I can assure you, as both Fine Gael and the Labour Party saw this issue of one of political life and death, which indeed it was, and it didn't engage in the niceties of academic debate. In fact, we in the Labour Party campaigned on the slogan that the straight vote is crooked, which indeed it is. And that said it all. So that brief resume answers the question of why we chose this system, or why the system was chosen for us, and how we have wound up with it and what sort of debate we had. The answer is its adoption was an accident of history, and in terms of debate, we've had virtually none. So we have wound up then with being one of 4 member states not using the list system, apart from Malta. The others are the United Kingdom and France, of course. But looking at it as a political practitioner, not as an academic or a member of the media, but looking at somebody who knows how parties work from the inside, both France and the United Kingdom have a de facto party system, a list system. So we are even more exceptional, and that, I always think, is a cause for worry. Now, that leads to the questions about the systematic analysis of the defects, which up to very recently have been, the answer has been very little. However, both Noel and I participated recently, 2 years ago, in a debate by the former members of the Oireachtas in a one-day seminar devoted entirely to the issue of reforming the electoral system. And what I'm going to say now is basically summarises what I said on that occasion. I would start off with, I think, a fundamental point. I believe the first requirement of an electoral system is, apart from proportionality, which is handled now by the Constituencies Commission, leaving that aside, that it should be instrumental in ensuring a functioning, effective and professional legislature, as well as being a representative assembly. And to my mind, Parliament is the core of the democratic system, and the electoral system must therefore, as a primary requirement, produce competent parliamentarians. Because of the growing complexity of political life, the job description of the parliamentarian is now being expanded into that of policy originator and public investigator, as well as legislator and representative of the people. And what we find everywhere else, I believe, is we find professional parliamentarians as distinct from professional politicians. I was both. There is a difference. And you have professional politicians who are parliamentarians primarily, with the time and the talent to make Parliament work as an institution of the state, particularly in relation to economic policy, which brings us very much up to present. For that to happen, you need a functioning committee system where the focus is on the affairs of society as a whole. And for that to happen, you need parliamentarians with the time and the talent to do this work. Now, you ask yourself the question, does STV produce such parliamentarians? And the obvious answer is no. It produces politicians whose primary preoccupation is their own patch, and their other primary preoccupation is, of course, to get re-elected. I think that in our system, that the emergence or the election or the emergence or election of professional parliamentarians is a byproduct, an accidental byproduct of the system. The primary requirement of the candidate is to be a good candidate who's likely to be elected. And being potentially a good parliamentarian really doesn't attract itself either to the party in putting you forward or to the voters in voting for you. So this clearly has a deleterious effect on the supply of talent coming into the Dáil. But having come into the Dáil, you are then subject to what I would call the tyranny of the constant campaign. From the moment you are elected, you're starting to work on the next election. Because within the multi-member constituency, the competition for votes is continuous. It's time-consuming, it's exhausting, it's demanding, and it essentially consists of what Professor Battle-Shub famously described as badgering civil servants. And badgering civil servants is unavoidable. First, because of the competition, as I've said, and secondly, because of this rather direct link, which is this is the consequence of the Britishness of the system, the direct link between the Member of Parliament, the TD, and the constituent. And you stand or fall on the quality of the service you have delivered. Now, that concentrates the mind wonderfully. As Dr. Johnson once said about hanging, the deputy knows he must service the constituents, and the result of that, of course, is the clinic system. Dan O'Brien, I think, put this very well recently in the Irish Times when he used economics to look at the consequences of various systems of choice in what he called choice architecture, a concept developed by behavioural economists. And he argued that the choice architecture of our system produced exactly the wrong type of deputy, because the were basically focused on the local and on the short term, and not on the long term and on the concerns of the state. And he said the choice architecture on the continent produces a different type of parliamentarian, and I believe is absolutely right. But the other piece of economic analysis that can be applied is, of course, that of opportunity cost, which is a simple idea that you can't do two things at the same time. And if our parliamentarians spend most of their time in the clinic or looking after their clients, they can't do the obvious thing, which is also to be in the committee room or in the parliamentary room or in the library, thinking, reading, studying and doing the work of a committee. And I think this is tragic, because the committee system, which is very weak in the Oireachtas and really only evolved since the late 1970s, this is the place at which the legislative process is most open to being influenced, where civil servants and ministers must make themselves available to parliamentarians. But our parliamentarians, by and large, if they turn up, are not that well informed and are docile, and these are the ideal committees from the point of view of the civil service and of the members of the government. And the obvious casualty here is that of accountability. And the other obvious fundamental mistake or defect is that there is the lost opportunity for parliamentarians to make an input into national policy at the moment when it matters, and more interestingly now to look into matters of public policy or public policy consequences by way of investigation, such as, for example, the banking crisis. I finish with these words from thoughts from one of the great historian of the 20th century, an American academic woman from New England, Barbara Tuchman, whose magisterial work at the end of her life is The March to Folly. And she said the thing that we humans do worst is what we should do best, and that is govern ourselves. And she goes through the whole of history to prove this. And she calls making the wrong choice when you know that it is the wrong choice and when you're warned about the choice you're making and about its terrible consequences. She calls this the march to folly. That's the march I believe we're on. I think we should maybe halt and have a look over the edge. Thank you.